Okay. Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined by Udo Schüklenk, who is Professor of Philosophy at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario Research Chair in Bioethics, and he is the Editor-in-Chief of Bioethics since '97 and the founding editor and Editor-in-Chief of Developing World Bioethics since 2000. He has written, edited, or co-edited 10 books and authored or co-authored some 100 plus publications in peer-reviewed journals and anthologies. I'm also joined by Sandra Dunham, who is the Executive Director of Development at Centre for Inquiry Canada and has over 30 years of experience in the nonprofit and charitable sector. She recently wrote an article on medical assistance in dying in Canada for the CFIC newsletter, Critical Links, titled End of Life Choice, What's Religion Got to Do with It? Thank you both for coming on the channel.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
I also want to plug two books that are coming out by Udo. I didn't
ask for that, but knock yourself out.
Well, because I was going to get your bioethics anthology with Peter Singer and Helga Koos, right?
Yeah, the fourth edition. We are right now on the PDFs. So it'll be 900 pages. Is coming in September.
That is so exciting. I was going to get the third edition, and then I saw the fourth one's coming out, and I'm like, perfect.
Yeah.
So yeah, very excited about that. And also from Oxford University Press, Conscientious Objection in Medicine, right?
That's correct, with Julian Sobolewski at Oxford and Alberto Giublini and Francesca Minerva. So it's 4 people. We are fairly close to finishing that manuscript, yeah.
That's exciting. Do you have well, you got to wait for the manuscript to be done for a potential date, right?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect they're looking for the fall term, so around September, probably October, all going well, but who knows?
Okay, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Udo, you were also involved with the Royal Society of Canada expert panel on end-of-life decision-making report in 2011, right?
That's correct. It was quite fortuitous. The Royal Society of Canada in 2009 appointed an international panel of experts, and I chaired the working group, basically the panel. And we wrote a report, 120 pages, about that length, on end-of-life decision-making in Canada. And one of our suggestions was that Canada should legalize medical assistance in dying. That was published in 2011, and fortuitously, really, at that time, various cases were winding their way through the Canadian court system. And the initial important judgment, to my surprise, made extensive use of the content of the report, and we had excellent legal people on the report, like Jocelyn Downey, for instance, at Dalhousie University, and a bunch of other people. And then the Supreme Court of Canada, of course, in 2015 set aside the provisions in our criminal code that criminalized medical assistance in dying. So yeah, it was just by chance that our report came about when all of this was happening in the legal sphere.
Do either of you want to expand upon yourselves and the work that you do for anybody that's not familiar with your work? Okay. So before we get into the discussion, Udo, you have, would you like to present a little intro into what's going on for the viewers?
Yeah, if you don't mind me sharing, I'll try this while I'm talking now, just a few slides from a longer presentation on medical assistance in dying. My objective really is just to share with your viewers and with the two of you how we got where we are today and why we have this really acrimonious debate that is currently going on in, actually, it would be going on in Canada if there wasn't COVID. That is my suspicion. So right now, I think it's fair to say that it's limited to a number of really aggrieved activists on the one hand, and politicians both in the Parliament and in the Canadian Senate. So the first thing that you see here is the criteria that the Supreme Court of Canada put down in 2015. It's saying basically that the prohibition on physician-assisted suicide is void insofar it deprives competent adults, that's important already, competent adults at the time of decision-making, so no mature minors, for instance, no people who don't have decisional capacity. So that's the first standard. You got to be competent and you got to be an adult. Secondly, you need to be somebody who clearly consents to the termination of life. Now, that is also very important because it was understood as saying advanced directives, where you basically make a decision for a time when you have lost competence for yourself, that advanced directives are out. This is how people read this. And the third condition then is that the person asking for this has a grievous and irremediable medical condition, including an illness, disease, or disability that causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual in the circumstances of his or her condition. Now, this is remarkable in many ways, because when you look at this, nowhere is it saying that your disease condition requires that you must be close to death or near death, or in fact that the disease condition is even causing your death in the foreseeable future. None of that. The only standard here is you're competent, your disease is such that it renders your life not worth living in your considered judgment, and your disease condition is irremediable, using the means that are available in the medical system here on the one hand, and that are acceptable to you. So this is the standard, the legal standard that the Supreme Court of Canada set. What is the? I'm just trying literally to go next. Okay, here. Okay, here's the next slide. So what are the ethical values driving this judgment? After all, I'm a philosopher, I'm an ethics guy. There's only one really when you think about it, namely respect for individual patient autonomy and the self-regarding choices we as patients make vis-a-vis our end of life. What doesn't matter here is other people's views, and I'll get back to this later on in our discussion, I hope, when we talk about a United Nations report who said disabled people must never make those choices because their lives are never so miserable that medical assistance in dying would be an acceptable option. So here, what doesn't matter then in Canada actually are other people's views, like those people's views about somebody else's quality of life. What does matter is decisional capacity, I mentioned it, plus a serious intractable medical condition that causes the decider intolerable suffering. The government at the time, this is our current legislation, made a hash of that. I'm going to say hash of this. I wrote an editorial, an opinion piece in the Globe and Mail saying the legislation that you see here on this slide, that's where we are right now, is unconstitutional. Because look what they made out of what was a really straightforward set of conditions set by the Supreme Court in their decision. So you must have a serious incurable illness, disease, or disability, and you need to be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability. There's nothing in the Supreme Court saying that you need to be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability. Then the illness, disease, or disability, or that state of decline causes you enduring physical or psychological suffering that is intolerable to you and that cannot be relieved under conditions that you yourself consider acceptable. That is arguably something that you would find that you could read in the Supreme Court document. And then here's the important bit why this became so controversial. The natural death, they're saying, has become reasonably foreseeable. And now, of course, reasonably foreseeable, I mean, all our deaths are reasonably foreseeable. On its own right, this is just stupid, right? But to be fair to them, how they understood this is really to say, well, the disease condition makes your death reasonably foreseeable. And while nobody said it, what people had in mind, basically terminal illness, 6 months life expectancy, give or take maximum. Now, there's nothing in the Supreme Court judgment that would allow that kind of restriction. So surprise, surprise, 2 disabled Quebecers went to court over this. Jean Truchon, who since received on his request medical assistance in dying, and he died in April 2020, and Nicole Gladu, and they were the plaintiffs. And they basically said that the current legislation that we have is violating our charter rights because they are too restrictive, especially because the federal government requires that a person's natural death has become reasonably foreseeable, and the Quebec legislation requires that a person be at the end of life. Jean Truchon had cerebral palsy, and Nicole Gladu has post-polio syndrome. So in 2019, Justice Christine Baudouin, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, found that reasonably foreseeable and end of life breached the charter, and she struck them down. At the time, of course, an election campaign was going on, and Justin Trudeau was saying, okay, we will abide by this judgment. So we're not going to stuff Canadians around in yet another legislative draft. So we will remove reasonably foreseeable and end of life. But that, of course, then opens a whole can of worms, right? because the question then is scope. Well, who should be eligible, right? And the two big bugbears here are, to my surprise, not mature minors. They're still out, but instead, people with disability, who suffer from disabilities or who live with disabilities that render their lives not worth living in their best judgment, but that could still mean for them to live for a very long time, for decades potentially. Should they be eligible? The other group of people where this is hugely controversial are people with psychiatric illnesses, right? Because not everybody with a psychiatric illness lacks decisional competence. So there are some people, in fact, many people with psychiatric illnesses who have decisional capacity. What if some of them decide, as for instance, people with intractable depression, some of them anyway, say, you know what, I have the capacity, I want my life to end, I'm asking for medical assistance in dying, should they be eligible? So what the government then did, I skip over this, what the government then did, and this is where we are right now, they produced a legislative draft, a thing called Bill C-7. And what they've done then, the federal government, and they decided that they would remove reasonably foreseeable as an eligibility threshold. And what they are proposing in this legislative draft basically is a two tracks towards medical assistance in dying. The old track that I just talked about, death reasonably foreseeable and all the other conditions are met. And another one where natural death is not foreseeable. And what they then have introduced, and honestly, I have no qualms with most of that. Procedural safeguards on the second track are more onerous. What I have great issues with is that they exclude individuals with mental illness as their sole underlying medical condition from accessing MAiD. And here's the first thing that the Senate did. They put an 18 months time limit to this. They're saying this will expire. So federal government has to figure out how decisionally capable people with mental illnesses who suffer from a disease that in their best judgment renders their lives not worth living, how they can access this. So the federal government basically decided, you know what, we buy ourselves time, we revisit this in 5 years' time. And the Senate basically in the legislation they sent back to them, they said 18 months. After 18 months, this will expire because it's nonsense, and I think it is nonsense. What the federal government instead did was something that was completely bonkers to my mind. They said under Bill C-7, a mental illness will not be considered an illness, disease, or disability for the purpose of the assisted dying law. This will never pass a charter challenge where you decide that a group of people that suffers from a clear disease condition that is uncontroversially exists, right? They're saying, yeah, but for this legislation, you know, we just don't think that's an illness. That's not how that works. And they kind of knew that, of course, but the nice thing with politicians is they hate really taking responsibility for things that are controversial. So this is why they put this in. And I end here. I just wanted to flag that the Canadian Psychiatric Association, to my surprise, was highly critical of this. They said a provision that applies only to people with mental illness without appropriate justification is discriminatory in nature. It's arbitrary. A provision that applies to all people with mental illness without appropriate justification is unconstitutional because it's overbroad. So explicitly stating then that mental illness is not an illness, disease, or disability is inaccurate, stigmatizing, arbitrary, and discriminatory. And this is where we are right now. So basically, the other thing we are getting that the Senate also introduced advanced directives. Personally, I'm ambivalent about advanced directives. I'm probably the odd guy out otherwise. Otherwise, I'm all gung-ho, you know, absolutely have a much more liberal regime. I am not a fan of advanced directives, but this is, we can discuss it or we can leave it. This is the scope of the debate. And disability rights activists have fought tooth and nail to exclude, strangely, disabled people from accessing medical assistance in dying, despite the fact that the only reason why we're having the current legislative changes is because disabled people went to court to achieve that. And yet, when you listen to the Twitter sphere, you will think it's only able-bodied people like me that propose that disabled people should be able to make these choices, just like everybody else who considers their lives not worth living because of the disease that they suffer from. But this is really the big issue. Then then strange document came about, the United Nations expert panel, and honestly, you can have an argument what kind of experts these people are. Suffice it to say that these people declared the following, because they were basically, it was timed really to interfere with Canadian legislation, with our efforts to get our national legislation sorted out. So you have these experts here, United Nations human rights experts, and they said basically, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons, I'm reading this from a website here, so we'll be very quick, is my last point that I want to make. They're saying extending assisted dying to people with non-terminal conditions contravenes Article 10 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, quote, which requires states to ensure that persons with disabilities can effectively enjoy their inherent right to life on an equal basis with others. And then they continue, when life-ending interventions are normalized for people who are not terminally ill or suffering at the end of their lives, such legislative provisions tend to rest on or draw on strength from ableist assumptions about the inherent quality or worth of the life of the person with a disability, unquote. This is all nonsense, of course. Why is it nonsense? Because it is not me making that decision. It's not you making that decision or the government making this decision. When you look at the criteria, it's very clear that the people that make these decisions would be disabled people themselves. If you choose not to, knock yourself out. If I don't do it, it's my business. Nobody has to do that. So this is bizarre. And yet this is the big expertise that currently these activists are running around saying, look, the United Nations College of Canada. And to me, it's like, what on earth were they on about? This makes no sense.
It packs a lot of punch when you have the UN.
I'll leave it at that. Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
It's a rhetorical tool. It's a campaign tool. Yeah. But one should be clear about what it really is. It's also important to flag that this is not a United Nations view. These are like 3 people appointed by the Human Rights Council or some other body, some other unaccountable body at the United Nations. And these 3 people basically express their individual opinions. It's not even the United Nations opinion. It's just some experts who think that. And they got the UN label because UN appointed them. But this is not a view actually by the United Nations, because they would do a damn to have a view on these matters. It's none of their business. Anyway. So yeah. I'll leave it at that.
Sandra, can I bring you in and talk about your article that you released, explaining the religious part of what's happening in Canada?
Sure. So many hospices in particular across Canada are refusing to offer medical assistance in dying. As well, if you are a faith-based hospital, or I believe long-term care, you can opt out of providing that service based on sort of a conscientious objection. Within the hospice movement, interestingly, many non-Christian-based, non-faith-based hospices are also opting out. And the article I wrote talked about 2 of them, one in North Bay, Ontario, and one in one of the health districts in British Columbia, where they're specifically refusing. And in the instance of the hospice in British Columbia, I gather that the health authority has said, you have no reason to opt out, so you must do it. And in order to give them a way to opt out, what they did is imported a bunch of members who were of the same faith as a couple of the board members who wanted to opt out. And then that group voted to make the hospice a faith-based hospice so that they were able to opt out. And the health authority didn't allow that. So the hospice palliative care movement seems to have and I've worked in it for a number of years, they have a philosophical objection to the concept of medical assistance in dying. My personal experience was the majority of hospices in Ontario were opting out, not all though. And those that haven't opted out are very quiet about whether they've opted in or opted out, because of course, hospices are reliant on people making donations. And regardless of which side of that argument you land on, you're going to offend somebody. But I know when I was working in palliative care and some of the hospices choosing to opt out, specifically indicated in order that they could opt out.
Okay, thank you. Did you have anything that you wanted to either of you want to start or continue? Okay, I'm going to jump in. So I became more aware of this through the Daily News. It's like a philosophy, I don't know what to call it, a news blog. And a philosopher that I follow, Shelley Tremaine, she has a blog named Biopolitical Philosophy. And she wrote a book. She's one of, I'd consider one of the leading philosophers of disability. And she objected to this Bill C-7. And I was very confused because I was hearing conflicting narratives from disability rights activists, disability organizations, Dying with Dignity Canada, and also I follow Udo's work as well, and some other bioethicists. And the concern, I just don't see a middle ground here happening. And I'm curious about how would you articulate the criticism of, particularly with Shelley Tremaine's biopolitical blog, within the context of some of the objections of feminist philosophers in Canada and bioethicists in Canada, because this is one of the narratives that I've been seeing from Trudeau Lemains as well, and a couple of other bioethicists on the other side. I was wondering if you could expand on that, Udo.
Well, it is really the same content that you got from these United Nations people, right? So it is, the view is held that if death for you is not imminent, and the disease condition in that context that you experience is such that your life is absolutely miserable and renders it not worth living in your best judgment, that is not comparable to the quality of life that some disabled people, for instance, might experience as a result of the disability. So here the view is held on that side of the argument that what really renders the lives of some disabled people not worth living in their judgment is not actually their disease condition, but or their disability, because some of them would even argue that the disability is not a disability, is otherwise not able-bodied, or whatever the terminology is that you pick here. But basically that their quality of life is not a result of their disease, of their condition, but instead is a result of the social determinants of health, access to services, access to welfare, access to accessible housing, access to, I don't know, healthy foods, sports, name it, whatever it might be, right? What I think that criticism actually is not stupid at all. I think it makes perfect sense to note that the services that are available to disabled people are subpar, right? And the same, by the way, is also true for people with mental health issues. Anybody who suffers from mental health issues and tries to access psychiatrists or psychologists here in a reasonable time frame will discover that's nigh impossible. Short of you trying to commit suicide, there's almost certainly nobody around when you need them. The question, though, is what it is that you derive from that in terms of policy, because their view is basically, because of that, we got to ensure basically that all these disabled people or people with mental health issues must not choose medical assistance in dying. Then they're still saying ultimately, well, you need to continue suffering, because unless they or I are able to change that situation, right? Pour the resources into the healthcare system that ensures that all these services are available when they're needed. And in brackets, that's not even for us patients who are able-bodied the case. If I try to see a specialist in this country, it can take half a year or a year. What I'm trying to understand basically is why they think it is important enough, the political stance that they're taking here against that system, which I think is a valid point, that at the same time creates a sound reason for saying, and because of that, we will subvert the agency, the ability to choose, from people who are affected by the system and can't bear it any longer. And in brackets, of course, there are also really disabilities that render people's lives not worth living, no matter how much in terms of resources you throw at them. So my answer then would be, let us do everything we can to improve that system. Get government to commit, when they produce this legislation, to put more resources towards care or assistance for people with disabilities. That's where I have no argument with them, because I think the criticism is right. What follows from that, I think, is not what they think follows from it, because the reality is, if these resources are made available, there will still be some people who still consider their lives not worth living. That's just the reality, because some of the disease conditions, like Trichon's, for instance, have been atrocious. And no matter how much money you would have thrown at him, he would still have thought, you know what, this is too miserable. I've had enough of this, given how he deteriorated. So this is what I'm struggling with. And what I'm also struggling with is that these people then, when you make this argument and you are not disabled yourself, basically they tell you you're an ableist. And this is why I wanted to quote Nicole Gladue, whom I mentioned earlier in the Quebec court case. And she said the following. She said, vulnerability is used by these people ad nauseum. And they're paternalistic people in good health, typically. Think Trudeau Lemons is the perfect example. I mean, there's no disability there. They are standing in the way of MAiD. So here's a disabled person basically saying, I've really had enough of these able-bodied people standing in my way. And that's where we really are, right? So this whole ableism business, you know, don't listen to Schüklenk, listen to Trudeau Lemons instead, right? Because he agrees with Shelley Tremaine, for instance, right? I find this absurd, because what we need to focus on is the quality of the argument. And we got to ask ourselves, well, even if they are right, because I think the criticism is right about the state of affairs with regard to the provision of services and healthcare to disabled people, and by the way, many other Canadians who are not even disabled. To me, it's still not clear what it follows from there, that therefore we need to remove the agency from disabled people to make these sorts of self-regarding choices. That's what I find absurd. And this is, of course, why they are coming after me, which is fair enough, I guess. It's politics.
I want to just bring up, are you familiar with Tim Staton by any chance?
Give me the argument. I don't know.
So he wrote a paper in BMC Medical Ethics titled Disability, Vulnerability, and Assisted Death, Commentary on Tufrey, Wynn, Kerfs, Finlay, and Hollins. In that paper, he brings up, and multiple people on Twitter talking about this, the two cases, at least two cases, of Roger Foley and Sean Taggart. These are cases where MAiD was offered, and I don't know what the outcome of that, but it's exactly the fear that they worry about, where services are denied, but access to MAiD is easier than these services, and leads to people being pressured to kill themselves. Is there currently, or going to be in the future, safeguards in place so that doesn't happen? Or like, for example, when I think about this case, I think about the abortion pro-choice arguments as well. So some people were saying, well, there will be abortion doctors botching abortions, and you know, this is a terrible thing. And I think that there definitely is ableism within the medical industry, but it doesn't, like, what happens with that is that you for people that abuse it, you charge them, you criminally charge them, right?
Precisely.
But I don't know if that's what the case is in Canada. Like, is there safeguards for that or not?
Well, I mean, at the moment, what you have when you look at the safeguards, right, that they put in is the number of witnesses. There is a waiting period for people who don't suffer from terminal illnesses, because the argument is essentially they suffered under this condition for so many years. They can wait another 10 days and think carefully about whether this is something that they really want, or 14 days, or whatever it is. Quite honestly, I have no view on that question. My view is you can make that really restrictive. I have no concerns about that. What I'm opposed to is to say there needs to be a blanket prohibition. That's the only thing that I'm adamant about. I think other than that, Canada would be well advised to have a very stringent, what we call safety belts requirements, basically, to ensure these are red flags that people are raising. And I think one should take them very seriously and think about how can we create a system that takes that into account versus saying, hey, throw our hands up, too bad, we just remove the agency and decide, you know what, you're all not eligible, the end. How you suffer, tough. Or if you follow the United Nations, apparently you can't suffer that much anyway, because it's just a system. And once the system is wonderful, you'll be also wonderful, which is nonsense. For many disabled people, not for everybody, but for many people, that is certainly true, right? Think about people with refractory depression, for instance. It's just not the case that if you throw a psychiatrist and a psychologist and a lot of social workers at them, that somehow they will be excited and happy and their lives will be wonderful. And I can tell you this because it is in my family. I know exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm sick and tired of these people going on and on about nonsense like these United Nations experts, quote unquote. But the bottom line about the safeguards, absolutely. And as far as I'm concerned, the more the merrier. I'm really open to initially a very restrictive regime, where you then might loosen some of these restrictions if you discover that they're working, some of them that they are necessary or that they prevent people from access. But where we are at the moment is that people are just stomping around saying nobody ever, period, because social determinants of health. And that really completely ignores actual devastating suffering that very many people experience. And I think it's just really, it's really unfortunate. It's also unfortunate, I think, how this debate has deteriorated and how quickly people throw around labels like ableist, just because you present an argument that a disabled person disagrees with, when in fact there's another disabled person that agrees with that argument, or who agrees with that argument. So the argument itself cannot be invalidated by pointing to the person bringing it on. It's just really nonsense. And as an academic, it's even stranger that people like Shelley Tremaine and Trudeau Lemons, of course, think that they can do away with arguments that they disagree with by basically pointing fingers at people and saying, hey, ableism, or you're ignoring this, or look, the United Nations, wonderful people. None of these are arguments at the end of the day, because the United Nations claims, for instance, they can be tested. Is it really true that somebody like Truchon, for instance, that his life would have turned wonderful once the services would have been available to him? And when you look at his particular disease condition, I encourage you to just Google him. It is obvious that would not have been the case. And this is why he asked for assistance in dying. And he made that point in April. He said, no matter what they would have offered to me, my life could not have possibly got better. This is nonsense. This may be true for some people, and we should protect them. We should provide those services. We should spend more on this. But me, that would not have helped me. And it's important. I'm just very passionate about this. I cannot believe that people are glossing over this by throwing, Trudeau Lemons called me both stupid and an idiot, which is interesting, just the terminology when you think about psychiatric illness.
Yeah, this ableist language, yeah.
But you know, this is Trudeau Lemons, right? You can't help it.
Well, this is kind of what I'm disappointed in, is because like when I got into philosophy, well, I didn't get into philosophy. I'm still like an amateur reading about this stuff, right? But one of the things that I enjoy about conversing with philosophers is that you guys go back and forth focusing on the arguments, no matter how heated it can get. I mean, we're talking about some like medical triage, for example, or conscious objection, or abortion, or you name it, or gene editing, with CRISPR and stuff like that. But this has really sparked some ad hominems going back and forth from academics that I haven't seen in other discussions on bioethics that I have. I'm just surprised by that.
I think it's and by the way, Sandra, you should really get into this, otherwise this is just ridiculous, two guys talking. But
I'm fascinated, and also I'm nodding, I'm agreeing very much. So it's not like I have a contrary opinion, maybe unfortunately for the show.
Well, what I just wanted to say, Mark, honestly, to some extent, I don't even care too much about all the mudslinging, because it just shows you really how passionate people are. Because while my opinion of much of the work that Trudeau Lemons does is really, really low, I suspect he, just like I, has a strong personal motive that is not coming out, whether it's a family story or whatever else. I can tell you to me, this is personal experience. This is why I'm passionate about this. This is what drives me writing about this. Habermas talked about this. He called it this erkenntnisleitende Interesse, which really means like what is it that drives you to focus on this particular question? Because let's face it, Trudeau Lemons, before he got into this with the passion, he worked on stuff where I would have agreed with him most of the time. It was like drug pricing and the terrible conduct of pharmaceutical companies. And I would have agreed with virtually everything he was saying there. And then suddenly out of the blue, he jumps into this and now pretty much does nothing other than this. Is on the campaign trail for the last God knows how many years, just to prevent certain people that he's very particular about shouldn't access this. Now, surely there are personal issues that drive that. It's not just some pure impartial academic interest. I've never pretended otherwise. I was very open about this all the way from the beginning. In fact, refractory depression is prominent in my family. I know exactly what I'm talking about. And this is also why I don't take some of these nonsense arguments, because I know what it means. And almost certainly something like this, I don't know what it is, will drive him too, because otherwise he would be much more impassionate. This is precisely why we are so passionate. And this is also why I don't take it too personal, if that makes any sense at all, because I understand why people are so passionate, because so much is at stake.
Yeah,
and clearly he and I, or Shelley and I, will have had very different experiences. That drives basically our arguments, no doubt, right? And the policies that we think are right. And this is why we are so passionate. And this has disintegrated to such an extent, well, it is what it is.
Yeah, my mother died of ALS in 2012, so I've been thinking about palliative care, hospice care, end-of-life decision making ever since, well, like before she even died. So like this has been part of my consciousness for a while, and the ethics behind it. Sandra, I was curious if you had anything that you want to expand upon.
No, I'm perhaps a bit like Udo in that I do have some personal, and you, Mark, that I do have some personal experiences that have sort of led to what I feel about MAiD. But one of the things, like as in with the ableist argument, is that often in order to put our opinion across, what we have a tendency to do is to exaggerate all of the situations. And I'm much more familiar with the argument that happened between the pro and the anti MAiD contingents as this legislation was being passed, and the harm that it did. So at that time, the people who were opposed to any kind of physician-assisted dying were promoting the fact that a huge number of people were going to be euthanized without their consent, and there was some type of a report about the number of people in the Netherlands who were euthanized without their consent. And my assumption is likely that there is some type of an advance directive allowed in the Netherlands, so they didn't consent in the moment. I don't know that for a fact, but that's my assumption. On the other side, the pro-MAiD people are talking about people dying and writhing in agony and pain. And in the 21st century, people are mostly not dying, writhing in agony and pain. And when you look at the reasons why people said that they wanted physician-assisted dying, pain is very, very low on the list. Fear of pain is quite high on the list, but actual pain is low. And mostly it's people that they're exhausted. They're exhausted of deteriorating one day at a time. And they just, for whatever reason, are not finding that there's quality in what they have remaining in life. And I feel like the question around whether people with disabilities should be able to request physician-assisted dying, and are we diminishing the value of their life where it is? And I don't believe we are. I mean, I could see that, perhaps if you were an artist and you spent your entire life producing art and you lost your vision, maybe that's the thing that really makes life worth living. It would be different for me. And to say that somebody, because they have a disability, is incapable of deciding what makes their life worth living diminishes their personhood. And what we know about people at the end of life in the disease trajectory, is that often people who request physician-assisted death don't ever use it. So they go, they say, I want this. They jump through all the hoops that they need to, and they know it's available to them because they're afraid that they may not be able to cope another day. So they've got it, and then their level of anxiety about what's going to happen next goes way down. So when I think about somebody with a serious mental illness or depression, and I have a personal experience with suicide, and I think that person never sought help because he didn't believe that it would ever help him. And the fact is, I have no idea whether, you know, somebody who chooses a violent end would go to a less violent end because it was available. But the violent end is very violent, and it's very challenging for the people who discover the body, who have to clean up after the body, who have to live with knowing how much pain somebody would have to be in to choose that out. So having that other option, I like to think will save some families that kind of pain, and possibly would stop somebody from taking their life because they would have that ability at any time. They could say, okay, I've jumped through all these hoops and maybe I can do one more day. I don't know the answer to that, but what I do know is that when they are choosing the more violent way, they are making a choice.
I have a quote here by Nuala Kenny, professor of emeritus Dalhousie University with the Department of Bioethics. And I'm just curious about your comment on this. The commercialization of medicine is fueled by contemporary bioethics, dominated by the principles-based approach of Beauchamp and Childress. Respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Each principle is of equal importance, but erroneous prioritizing of autonomy has promoted a model of physician-patient relationship where the patient becomes a customer who knows best. What do you think about that?
I think historically she's simply wrong. I know Nuala, by the way. It's a lovely colleague, and I respect her work. Beauchamp Childress' book came out. It's a classic North American thing, and honestly, I think I have a very low opinion of this principle-based framework bioethics. It is very simplistic and it doesn't really work terribly well. And we see that at the moment in all these COVID frameworks that are principle-based, they're all not action guiding or action justifying. However, the commercialization of medicine precedes this book by decades. It's as simple as that. So if anything, it is an attempt to introduce ethics into that framework, but not the other way around. So this is my honest take on this. It has nothing to do really with the commercialization of medicine that happened prior to that. And in fact, it's even more absurd when you think about healthcare systems like the UK's NHS, for instance, that are non-commercial, and they still use those principles. So these principles really do not rely on any particular system. You could think, for instance, about China today, those parts that are fully state-sponsored. You can still think about the patient relationship in terms of those principles if you wanted to, right? So it is not premised on any particular commercial model underlying the healthcare system. But what is true is that it was written by people who lived in a healthcare system that was totally commercial because it was in the United States. So yes.
I have a user-submitted question that I'd like to read if you don't mind. Okay, it's actually by Shauna Watson, Educational Chair of CFI. Of course, people who choose to live with their disabilities should be provided with assistance and support to a greater extent than they are now. However, there will still be people who, regardless of any supports available, still find it personally unacceptable for them to continue. The question is, why does offering the opportunity for some people to make their choice render it a problem. The religious approach is that there is simply a value of life of any sort, but it is difficult to find a non-religious objection to MAiD beyond that. And it seems to me that some people may be attempting to use the disability argument as an attempt to bring this in the back door. As for my question, I am curious as to whether people who object to these proposed new provisions for MAiD have similar objections to DNR orders, because especially since COVID, a lot of people have been saying that if they needed an ICU for COVID treatment, they would choose to forego that. And their choice is based on the idea that they would rather die on their own terms instead of while on ventilator, or they would like to leave the ventilator space for others. Dr. Brian Goldman, who is an ER doctor with a CBC radio show podcast, is of that opinion. He's in his 50s and otherwise healthy as far as I can tell.
Well, I'm not sure how this matches though on the current discussion, because there is a significant difference in law, right? Between people refusing particular treatment. That is today already the case, unless you have an infectious disease that is that risks the health of others. As far as self-regarding actions are concerned, you can say you're HIV positive and you refuse to take AIDS medication and eventually you die. Nobody can force you to take that medication if you don't want to, as long as then you don't have unsafe sex with other parties, and then you will die eventually. There is a significant difference really between saying somebody else will end your life, because most Canadians, interestingly enough, that opt for medical assistance in dying do not opt for assisted suicide. In other words, take the pill yourself. They opt for euthanasia. In other words, a doctor or a specialist nurse administers the medication that then will end your life. That is the difference. In the first case, we have a legal right for healthcare professionals not to interfere with our bodies while we are of sound mind and we understand what the consequences are. Here, the discussion, of course, is whether or not somebody should be eligible to receive euthanasia from somebody else that then will end their lives. There's a significant difference. So this is not the same situation. That's all I'm trying to say.
Right.
Is Shauna asking whether the same people who are opposing to MAiD are also in opposition to being able to issue a DNR order? I didn't quite understand the question, Mark.
Yeah, I'm curious as to whether people who object to the proposed new provisions for MAiD have similar objections to DNR orders.
No, not to my knowledge. There's nothing, certainly they haven't published it.
So I mean, you could have a do not resuscitate order for like that's for as long as I've been working. That's been something
Exactly.
that's been possible. And interestingly, I worked in the area of developmental services in the early 2000s, and this was the time where there was the large deinstitutionalization of individuals with developmental disabilities, and a lot of them ended up in community group homes. So these would be houses that had been retrofitted and they would move in. And a lot of the people who ran those group homes were very concerned because parents of these adult individuals with developmental disabilities, who were the substitute decision makers, would have DNR orders in place. And there's a lot of confusion about sort of the continuum between the provision or rejection of care, the do not resuscitate, and the medical assistance in dying. So because these parents had issued do not resuscitate orders for their children, the person who was running the group home at the time, who came to see me with concerns, was saying, oh, if Frank has appendicitis, we're not allowed to have the appendix removed. And that's very different from a DNR, right? Like a DNR is if the person stops breathing, that we're going to bring them back. We're going to restart their heart. And then even within that, as a functioning individual, as long as I'm competent, if I know that I have appendicitis and if it's not treated, it's going to be extremely painful and then I'm going to die, I can still refuse care. Now, I'm not.
Yeah, but here, what you're saying surely is strangely, proxy decision makers would be able to say, for my children, I'm flabbergasted. I did not know that anybody could do that, because remember, we have the consenting, in Ontario here, we have the consenting capacity boards, for instance, right, that would have a best patient interest standard where the patients can, the family members can say this, but if then there's a doctor in the house or a nurse in the house who says, this is in the patient's best interest, then it stops there. They can ignore it basically and go to and appeal to the consenting capacity board, where then this independent panel will make that decision. In an emergency, they would almost certainly be able to do that.
Yes, but a DNR order, I don't think that they would overturn. So if the individual living in a group home, their heart stopped.
From a proxy decision maker?
Yeah, would they?
No. I mean, I'm just speechless that could even be possible. I understand if I do that, I get that, because afterwards I can sue them. It is assault. They will be in serious trouble, right? They can't interfere with my body that way. But for somebody who has no decisional capacity, that a proxy decision maker would say, no, basically, if they stop breathing for whatever reason, no matter how easy it would be to fix this, there's a DNR in place. I'm speechless that that's possible, but maybe it is. I don't know. I mean, I'm just like,
you know, as an adult, your substitute decision maker is, if I'm unconscious and I'm admitted to the hospital, and they're going to go through the hospital staff are going to go through the list with my substitute decision maker, and they're going to ask, do you want resuscitation, correct?
Yes, but again, really, if say you were the substitute decision maker, right, for a loved one, and you decide and say your decision is frivolously, you don't like that person, whatever your reasons are, we will never find out, but you make a frivolous decision to say, absolutely, do not resuscitate. The clinicians, if they disagree, because if they think, for instance, that that person could successfully be resuscitated and would experience a good quality of life, they can ignore your decision. They have a way out, because that decision would not be in the patient's best interest. What our legal structure is basically saying, for ourselves, we can make bad decisions, but bad decisions for others are subject to review, proxy decision maker or no.
So who would decide that that was a bad decision? So I think in Shauna's question, she talks about the current COVID situation.
Yeah.
And early on in the COVID pandemic, my understanding, correctly or not, was that the rate of recovery for somebody on a ventilator was fairly low.
Yes.
And so I said to my substitute decision maker, who's my son, who tells me I talk about this far too much. Mm-hmm. I said to him, if I need to be on a ventilator and I can't speak for myself, I don't want to be on a ventilator. Don't let them do that.
Yeah.
So,
but it would have been sensible probably for you to have an advance directive in place.
But if you have an advance directive in Canada, my understanding is not legally binding. I can write everything I want down, and at the end of the day, the doctor is going to ask my substitute decision maker.
Yeah. Yeah, but still,
and
if then the two of them disagree, I don't think the doctor is forced to go along with what the substitute decision maker wants. If they believe it is not in your best interest, then they are also not the ones to decide. That is the kicker. They might put you in some holding pattern on how they would do it, but they would really have to go in our province here. They would have to go to the consenting capacity board. If then there is still a disagreement, say the consenting capacity board finds whatever you or the doctor, your son and the doctor, the party disagreeing then could still then seek a legal review. And in the meantime, of course, you would be on the ventilator, because the objective of these review proceedings would be to find out what really is in your best interest. And given that
that's very disheartening. It is very disheartening because, you know, I do understand that not every substitute decision maker is going to make the right decision. And in theory, my son would stand to inherit if I died.
I mean,
so,
normally it cuts the other way around. Normally it's doctors saying, normally it's doctors saying, you know, further treatment is futile. And
yeah,
then family members
give him everything. Yeah.
Give him everything and the kitchen sink. And then it goes through the court system. And in fact, this is what the courts have done in one case where the guy was brain dead basically, and the family said, regardless of this, our religious beliefs, in this case it was religious beliefs, we believe, you know, and of course there was, the hand was moving a little bit, and therefore, and the doctors decided they can do this. And I was pleased to see, to be honest, that the courts told the doctors, no, you are not the last instance. And then they were also told, in fact, you need to go to the Consent and Capacity Board. They'll make a finding on this. I think it's very rare, though, that it cuts the other way around. Namely that there is basically the family members saying, end this, and doctors saying, no, you know, we need to continue. So, yeah.
So interestingly, I said I was nodding through everything you said, and the one place that I think we might have a difference in opinion is the ability to have an advance directive around MAiD. And I understand the issue that one can't consent to a procedure in the future. So, you know, my understanding is I can't go to my doctor's office and say, yeah, in 3 weeks, I want you to do a knee replacement on me. But on the day that I get admitted to the hospital for the knee replacement, that's the day that I can consent. And I understand that there's probably good reasons for that. But one of the things that I feel really strongly about is a desire not to live with dementia. And so, you know, the catch-22 with physician-assisted dying is that you can't consent to, and I believe that this is being reviewed in C-7, you can't consent to physician-assisted dying in the future. So if I have Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia, and I know that I'm going to at some point have dementia and I don't want to, then my options are to end my life sooner to avoid that that inevitability that I am going to be living in a way that I don't want to live, and I can't say no at that time. And having been through dementia with several family members, I understand that some people who have dementia do really well and they're happy and they have no issues. But the majority of people that I've experienced with dementia are really struggling. They believe that terrible things are happening that aren't happening, and they're guarding their belongings, and they think people are stealing from them, and they become people who they never were. And so at this point, I can neither, so nobody can make a decision, a substitute decision maker can't decide to end somebody's life, and I can't consent to it in the future, leaving me with the only option of consenting to it sooner than I would. So I might have some quality days left that I have to eliminate.
Yes. So this is why, my understanding, this is why the Senate actually added an advance directive option to the bill that they sent back to the Parliament. So we'll see how that pans out. So my problem with advance directives is that we are using it because, how shall I put it? It's kind of a fiction, right? We try to extend autonomous choice to a time when we're not autonomous anymore. Now, to me as a philosopher, why that matters is because precisely when the advance directive kicks in, there is no personal continuity any longer. That's the kicker. So really the decision is made for somebody else who happens to reside though in that same body. That is my problem. As you mentioned, for some people, they can be perfectly fine. They might enjoy their jelly and they might watch some cartoons or however they spend their time. And this could go on for quite a while. And yet there would be an advance directive saying, end their lives. They might even fight that. Are we really? And so this is why my problem basically is that if I had any say in this, I would think you need two different kinds of tracks. One is an autonomy-based track where people make decisions about their quality of life. And then there could be a second track for people who do not have decisional capacity. In brackets, this will never happen, just to be clear, where people don't have decision because of abuse concerns that I think are reasonable. But basically for people who don't have decisional capacity, where quality of life determinations need to be made by other parties. And you could then create, like consented capacity boards do now, have an objective best interest criteria, and basically sort of you have a laundry list and you say, if that many boxes are ticked, then life no longer worth living. And you can see all the hoo-ha that would start if you do that. But because we can't do that, we end up with the second best option, where we have people basically making decisions really fundamentally for somebody else who happens to be in that same body. And I, as a philosopher, I struggle greatly with that whole idea that that should be possible. If there's somebody who's perfectly happy in their dementia and they can do this for another 10 years, nobody should be able to end their lives just because of some stupid advance directive. But that's maybe the only way to do this, to be fair.
Yeah, and that's where my preference, like I understand what you're saying in terms of the ability for somebody to abuse it, but my preference in my personal circumstance where I have no concerns at all about abuse would be that a substitute decision maker could make that choice for me, so that I could be very clear, which I have, to say, if I don't know who you are and you visit 3 times, and in your opinion, if you don't visit me anymore, I'm still happy and, you know, life goes on, then let me go check in with me every year and make sure I still seem to be happy. And, you know, I have every confidence that that decision would be made appropriately to what I'd asked. But I also understand that very few people are as clear about what they want, nor can everybody be as reliant on their substitute decision maker. And
well, there's another aspect, right? Is it really fair to put that decision actually on your son? That's another question.
It is a great question.
It will be quite distressing for that kid to basically decide when you've had enough.
Yeah, no, I hear you. But
so that's a reason in favor of advanced directives, then, you see.
so having said that, you know, whenever I'm talking to somebody about who their substitute decision maker is, I always say it's really important that you know that your substitute decision maker can live with the decision that you're asking them to make. And in my case, I chose somebody, you know, I had the option of several people I could have asked. And he was the one I asked because I think he gets me, and I think he could live with it. I also know one of the people, a step grandparent who I knew with dementia. Early in his dementia process, he asked his daughter several times if she would kill him. And of course, this is before medical assistance in dying it was available. And then when you start to ask, you know, what can I live with? I mean, how awful to be asked that several times and not to be able to do something about it. So there's
They're not, I mean, as far as I can see, there are no good options.
There are probably no good options.
So I'm not militantly opposed to advanced directives. I'm not in favor of them for the reasons that are outlined. I totally understand what you're saying. I'm not saying you're wrong or anything. For you, that might well work, really. And I also don't think it's realistic in any society to go down this track to have others make decisions for decisionally competent people to end their lives. That is so fraught when you just think about human history. I totally understand why people would be opposed to that. I still think that might not be a bad idea, but I think we're just looking at the lesser of the evils that are available. Pick your poison, literally.
Yes, I think you're quite right.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you?
No.
Don't you? So for me, I think the optics look really bad right now. When it comes to, there was a CBC program that had Jocelyn Downey, had Trudeau Lemains and Sarah Jama, I believe, and a few others. And I think it does, I'm going to play the race card. Like, it does look like a bunch of white able-bodied academics and lawyers making decisions on behalf of marginalized people. That's just the way that the media, at least that I'm seeing it through the media. Were disability groups, Indigenous people, were they consulted in the development of MAiD historically, or consulted with Bill C-7? Was that done?
Yes, the parliamentary procedure is that there are hearings where people who want to say something and have some kind of expertise, and it could really be just lived life expertise, indigeneity, ethnicity, name it, religiosity, MAiD, bioethics, pick it, can basically then write and say, hey, I want to address the select committee that is looking basically at ultimately producing this bill or whatever, however this works, or commentary on the bill, however that works. So I said, for instance, to give you one example, I said on the, I asked to speak to that committee. I was invited. Next to me was an Indigenous elder speaking to the same issue. Opposed to it, I'm bemused, I'm being honest here, I'm a secularist like you guys are. So there was this Indigenous person who only quoted a Catholic Pope on these issues, where I thought, okay, you might as well have gotten like a Catholic person and another Catholic person, that's some Catholic priest, right, a professional Catholic. But fine, so that was him. And next to him was a disabled person who came in a wheelchair. We asked to be heard, and we were heard, and there were many other people. This went for weeks. It is like military style. Like everybody has their 15 minutes. There's one or two questions that you get from the government party and the opposition parties, and then you move on to the next one and the next one, and then the three of you are out, and the next three come in, and they cover the whole gamut basically of people with an interest in this. Yeah.
They also, it seems to me that we were involved with a bunch of town halls. Like there was actually like a traveling show where there were speakers that came out, and they had I mean, it was cutting edge technology. Not that many years ago, they had the voting buttons so that everybody got to vote on their opinion about medical assistance in dying, which they called physician assistance at the time. Before and then after, like how people changed their mind. And they, you know, in the small community that I live in, I think they had, I don't know, 5, like a lot. They consulted a lot of people. But I want to come back to saying, you know, it's a bunch of white people and lawyers making decisions. So what both Udo and I are saying is that we think that whatever the legislation is should apply equally to all people in Canada. I think that's what you're saying. So whether you're able-bodied or you're disabled, here's the law, here's what it is. And the folks who are opposed to that are actually able-bodied people, from what you've told me, because I'm not following it that closely, to be honest, who are saying, we believe that these people have less rights to make decisions, are less good at making decisions about their own beings than these other people. So who's the ableist in that?
Well, I
Well,
think,
to be fair on their side, there is a significant number of disability rights activists who are disabled themselves.
Okay.
Like Shelley Tremaine, for instance, is just one example. But it is really important to just flag here that there is, surprise, as it would be in a diverse society, in a diverse community, it is just not the case that disabled people speak with one voice. And the question now is whether those who decide that, who think that other disabled people should also not make the choices that they despise, whether they should have the last say. That is one of the questions here. But what Mark, I just wanted to tell you, I was on TVO on this triage decision-making thing, and the question of whether it disabled unfairly against disabled people, and there were disabled people on that program too, as it should be, by the way. The CBC program that you talked to, I have no idea. I don't know who was on it, and let's be honest, the people that agree to show up and have their say there, usually when they call you, you just say yes, and you're glad you have an opportunity to influence a public debate. So they are probably not blameworthy for being on the program, but I think you're absolutely right to ask who on earth is producing these things, if it's really true what you said, that this was basically a bunch of white academics, all able-bodied, talking about disability. That is pretty embarrassing.
Well, this is what I'm kind of concerned with, is that the environment in which these discussions are had, whether or not multiple voices are being heard. And ironically, when it does come to the disabled activists, and the thing is, framing it as disabled activists, I think is even unfortunate, because one of the criticisms that I had, and of course it would be on Twitter, is that I'm not reaching out to disabled people, I'm reaching out to academics. But the reason why is because in my own personal life, I know disabled people that want this. So
exactly.
And
by the way, and if they say that, they will be slaughtered by these activists, let's be frank, and in a vicious, disastrous way. Just like if you look at Twitter at the moment, you see how they go after me, then you will understand. So there's a real problem there in terms of debating culture when it comes to this specific issue.
So that's it. So like, I have disabled people that are against it, people who are for it. So this is why I'm trying to look at the legality of it, the principles behind it, the bioethics behind it, so that I can have an informed decision about as well for myself. But the environment of bioethics, I don't know what it's like. I heard criticisms that it is white, able-bodied, and discriminatory towards, say, disabled philosophers. Another person that is quite vocal is Jocelyn Downey. She's a bioethicist, right?
Mm-hmm. No, she's remarkably, she has I think doctoral degrees both in law and in philosophy, and she does bioethics. But if you ask her, she would say she does health law and health policy. She's a health law professor at Dalhousie University.
Okay, yeah, and so she's like one of the people that I know is very active about this and has like a website dedicated to this.
She wrote a doctoral thesis on this.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Thesis. It's alive.
So I'm curious, what is the state of philosophy when it comes to disability and race within the field that would influence these ethics and laws?
Well, obviously, the majority of people, both in philosophy, but probably in most academic fields, are able-bodied. Fact. I think you might be surprised to find out that many people in the academy suffer mental health issues, both faculty members as well as grad students. It's one of those things. Whether this goes to such an extent that you would have reason to say they are disabled, I kind of doubt that. So at the same time, are there people that look, it's the best example. Are there people that make the case, for instance, that Shelley Tremaine is making in the academy? Yes, of course. Do they publish in academic journals? Yes, of course. True Lemons, in fact, is one of them. She's another one of those people, and there's plenty of others. The guy who wrote this editorial in the Washington Post, for some reason, telling Canadians how horrible our new legislative draft is, right? Is a faculty member at a Catholic university in the United States. So he's writing on these issues, and what I find reassuring is that on both sides of the fence, and there really are only two sides here, people have been publishing on this specific issue for many years in peer-reviewed journals. So the literature is there, the arguments are there, and the rest to me is mostly noise. I know that Shelley will think this is really offensive, but to me, this is really just noise. Even the Twitter stuff that's going on at the moment, that's all noise, because the arguments are there, they are clear, and you and anybody else who cares can read up on this and make up their minds about this or write their own stuff.
So that's actually my next question, is that if someone wants to read about the specific racial dynamics, disability dynamics within medical assistance in dying, who are the key players within Canadian philosophy talking about that, if they were to search like Phil Papers or something like that?
I don't know in Canada, honestly, because I don't read that stuff. I have literally, I don't know. Shelley is one of them, definitely. You know that. The only, when you think about the structure of philosophy departments in particular, right? They're still overwhelmingly white. My department has made significant strides in recent years to hire philosophers of color, hire more women, for instance, too. But we cannot force them, frankly, to now address these issues, to cover this gap. If they have no interest in this, this is what academic freedom is. They work on something else. One of them does epistemology, the other one does philosophy of race, and they have absolutely no reason to jump into this now because people think they need to say something on this issue.
Okay, well, what I meant is that, okay, so like we've named Josh, Shelley, Trudeau, Jocelyn, and I think I may named a few, but I'm trying to say, like, is there other people that are vocal about this, that are in academia, that are just talking about this as much as these people, including yourself?
Well, this is terrible now because I do not remember the name. In New Brunswick is a philosopher of color who has also a bioethicist of color who has a management position in the health service. There, a senior management position, who has written on this topic too. There's a Canadian bioethics journal, a bilingual one. He has written on these issues too. However, the number of people in Canada, we are a fairly small country, that are working on this at all is small. And amongst those, the people that have written about this, you mentioned most of their names. There's Arthur Scheffer still, then there is Wayne Sumner at University of Toronto. I could look up other names now, but off the top of my head, these are the names. And it's true that most of them probably are white guys. And this is it's a historical reason. Most philosophy departments still are white male. It has changed only in recent years that more women were appointed, that more people of color were appointed. That is the status quo.
Yeah. So
I mean, the question is, the other question I have to you though is, do you think that the same argument presented by a Black person changes the quality of the argument or the analysis? Or do you think the person would, or do you think, for instance, I mean, I'm married to a Black man, right? And when we talk about this, I can tell you that the kinds of arguments that we had here are the same arguments that we are having. So it's not that there is this Black person that suddenly comes up with like new arguments. He's a lawyer by training. So we have gone through this, we even published together. So if anything, I could say, well, yes, of course. I mean, I even published with a Black person on these issues. The arguments are the same. And he wrote half the article. So nothing really changed there. That's, I mean, I'm just so struggling to understand what difference that makes with regard to the arguments that are presented. Are they more valid or less valid, or what exactly is what changes?
Sandra, it would seem to me that like the issues around physician-assisted dying would be the difference between people of different creeds might be significant, and the difference between people with different disability backgrounds might be different. But yes. I don't understand how access to physician-assisted dying would be different for a person of a different race. Unless there was an ethnic, like I don't think it's your race. There may be an ethnic component to it.
Well, what we discovered when we wrote this, that you alluded to, Mark, the Royal Society of Canada report that we worked on for 2 years, from 2009 to 2011, we worked really hard at the time to try to see what are the attitudes of Indigenous peoples to assisted dying, and we couldn't find anything. I don't know whether this gap in the literature has since been closed, because honestly, I've been working mostly on conscientious objection, and I've spent some time writing on refractory depression and medical assistance in dying, but I have not really been on the campaign trail even on this issue, because I'm working on other topics right now. This is what is this would be something that would be of concern to me, that we don't know what attitudes there are. But then when you think about the legislation, if the attitude, for instance, would be, we are opposed to this, I'm thinking, knock yourself out, don't avail yourself of it. There's still no problem as far as I can see. It would be very different if you then enforced it on people, but that is not the case.
And that, I think, is often what people are concerned about, is this slippery slope, right?
Yeah, but this is exactly.
But I don't think that that's a race issue. I think I certainly see it as a disability issue.
One of the amendments that's going to the House, I believe, is for race-based analysis of people who do get MAiD.
Yeah, great.
I'm surprised that wasn't already in there, though. Like, do we not have that statistical analysis for race or disability?
The problem is that healthcare is provincial, and when you look at who runs some of our provinces, these are not the brightest people. When you look at Ontario, for instance, the Ontario Public Health Guy, this Williams guy or whatever his name is, for months and months and months, he said the COVID statistics will not be broken down by race. We're not collecting that information. And that's the end of that. If there's somebody who is not very bright and decides these sorts of things, and there's nothing you can do, even though this is terrible policy. It's even terrible from a public health policy, from a public health perspective. And this is quite possibly why these data were just not collected, because provinces would have to agree to that. And if they decide not to, for whatever reasons of their own, then these data just won't be collected.
So there is a great amount of data on
Yes.
People's choices at end of life, and I don't recall race being in it, but I did reference, I think, two sources: the Ontario database and the Oregon database, because Oregon is sort of in North America one of the longest. They've been allowing physician-assisted dying for, I think, longer than any other jurisdiction, and you can look at it going way back. So I think if that's something you're interested, I don't know whether there's race in any of them, but you might at an individual province level get that. I don't know. I only looked at Ontario.
Yes, yeah, basically if they decide to collect it, then yes, and otherwise we won't have it. And the federal government can't be blamed for not having it, because they can't force provinces to collect that information, because once it becomes a healthcare service, because it's one thing for the federal government to say we legalize it. It's quite another then to decide, well, how is this actually on a procedural level? How is this actually going to pan out in particular provinces? And if they decide to make it a healthcare service, then that's where you are. They will provincially, in each province, decide how they go about it, basically.
You asked me about if the arguments are just presented, what does it matter about the person presenting it if they're the same? I think there's difference of traditions when it comes to ethic, particularly when it comes to feminist ethics. They've been, at least, okay, again, I'm not an academic. I don't know if this is of the actual case, and the circles that I'm around may skew my bias, right? Mm-hmm. From what I've read, feminist philosophers are critical of consequentialism and utilitarianism that tends to be in the effective altruism movement, that tends to be against Peter Singer and his view of things. Like, it. Is that correct, or is that incorrect? And what do you think about that? Like,
I think it's only correct if you reduce feminist philosophy to an ethics of care, and to be fair, or some communitarian approaches to things, like some feminist philosophy, historically at least, was critical of male-centered approaches to thinking about things, right? So where basically you had the independent, macho individual, thinking cool, logically about things, and then coming to some clear conclusions. And they're saying, well, actually, you're not an island. In fact, you live in a community of people. And as Sandra pointed out, if somebody commits suicide, then somebody else, for instance, will find them. It might be a loved one or even a worker in a hotel room. All of these things need to be taken into consideration. And feminist philosophy and feminist bioethics was always critical of Kantian approaches, for instance, to ethics. They totally discarded that and just said, it's just like rationality and reason, blah, blah, blah. But when you look, for instance, at Jocelyn Downey, I mean, almost certainly she would insist that she's a feminist philosopher. She would take offense. And in fact, if you were to ask me, and I'm a utilitarian, if you ask me whether I'm a feminist, well, of course I'm a feminist. Who isn't a feminist? It's ridiculous to think otherwise of progressive, forward-looking people.
Yeah, that's why I wasn't saying the individuals, but the traditions.
Yeah, but that's my point. There's no contradiction, honestly, between being a utilitarian and being a feminist, right?
Right.
This is what I'm struggling with. I mean, who is not a feminist? I mean,
well, okay, like within Canadian bioethics, is there a popularity of normative ethic, of consequentialism?
I doubt it, actually. In my department, I'm the only utilitarian. I think at the University of Toronto, they might have two in the department. I might be mistaken. So you can safely assume that we're always the minority.
Okay.
It's mostly about Kantians and Rawlsians and any communitarians, name it.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. Yeah.
Yeah, as it should be. You want diversity of opinion. So I think it's great. This is I don't see that itself is an issue. I think the initial point you made about the dominance of white males or white able-bodied people, I think that's a point that is definitely well taken.
Is there something to be said about what I consider right now when I'm looking at people that are advocating against C-7, is this weird unholy alliance, I'm calling it an unholy alliance, with right-wing politicians and religious organizations? Are either of you witnessing that? Because for me, it's weird, because usually, the social justice progressive people are going to align, even if they criticize, right, the politicians that do this. But now they're going to the complete extreme end of like quoting Catholics that won't even, give you the right to marriage and stuff like that. And they're talking about social justice. So like, it's very confusing. Or women's rights for abortion, right? Like, so I don't know.
There's a long tradition of that. Feminism, for instance, was always very quick through the gate. Well, some feminists, not all feminists, but some feminists were quick through the gate, for instance, to attack Peter Singer, for instance, in Germany back when he suggested that abortion, in case you do prenatal diagnosis and there is severe disability, then abortion might not be a terrible idea. In fact, he argued in favor of that. And then feminists were like all out there. So essentially what they were saying is like, yeah, abortion for any reason other than disability. If there's disability, no, because otherwise you discriminate against the disabled. So this was completely absurd, obviously, and you would find them really in bed with the Catholic Church, essentially arguing against a liberal philosopher, a utilitarian philosopher, who was essentially saying women should have the right to choose whether ultimately it's abortion for no reason because they want to go on vacation, or because there is disability, or because of the sex of the fetus, or whatever it is. It should be a choice that women should be able to make. They didn't like that. They thought basically when there is no reason, quote unquote, like there is no disability, it's not about sex, then abortion is fine. The moment that you had a motive that they objected to, say disability or the sex of the fetus, then they wanted to interfere with that. And they went after Peter Singer. So there is a tradition of parts of feminist activism to find themselves in bed with the Catholic Church. Pornography is another example. Now you might say, well, right, they were absolutely right, pornography is evil, whatever. You can hold those views. The point is, deeply illiberal, having no qualms at all, going to bed with the most reactionary forces in theology you can think of, the Roman Catholic Church, in order to fight, in this case, pornography, for instance. So yeah, there is a history of that. I always find that interesting because I thought these people have nothing in common. They are like fire and water, but
yeah, I mean, there's obviously going to be some principles are shared, but like it's been odd to see historically. Sandra, do you have any comment on that?
I just in my I don't study philosophy, so the specifics I don't, but in my life I've discovered that people cozy up to people who they think can advance their cause. So yeah. I think we might disagree on X, but if we're fighting about Y, we're all together.
Is there any middle ground on this from the both sides?
Middle ground with regard to what? With regard to the current legislation issue, or?
Yeah, Bill C-7. Like, is there any way of?
Well, if the other side the other side, quote unquote. I'm, and you know what, I'm not even a politician. I have no say in this, right? But I'm thinking, if you're concerned about these abuse issues, these are all red flags, start regulating them, set up a really restrictive regime initially, put lots of safeguards in, put the waiting period in, ensure voluntariness, jot all of this down and basically make it difficult initially for people, and then see whether this works or whether there are cases of abuse, have transparent reporting like quarterly, annually, as we have at the moment anyway, have more detailed reports, have continuing research, resource health services for disabled people to a significant better extent than is happening at the moment, like put real money on the table and ensure that it goes there and nowhere else. So all these things I could, for instance, imagine, but here the main point is, it is all evil, they're out there to get us and they must be stopped, and that's the end of that. And I'm thinking, good luck. At the moment, things are looking good. So I suspect Parliament will just vote on this eventually and it will happen.
What do you think, Sandra?
I don't know, Mark. You know, we're assuming different people have different capabilities to make decisions, and we're assuming that if somebody makes a decision that's different from ours, it's a bad decision. I don't know. I would favor MAiD being more easily available for probably everybody. And you know, I probably fall on the side that some people would actively disagree with. I wonder if you're a senior and you've run out of money and you choose not to live that way, should you have the ability to say this is it? And it's fine to say, well, you should have more money, or the government should give you more money, or the government should give you more services, but the fact is, I'm the only one that can assess whether it's worth getting out of bed tomorrow or it's not worth getting out of bed tomorrow. And you know, my personal experiences with deaths of people that I love for a variety of reasons is the people who've gone easily into the night make the survivor's life easier.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have had the experience of somebody fighting death or ending their life violently, what that does to the survivor is terrible. And I think for somebody to say, you know what, this has been a good life or not, but I'm done with it now, and I'm choosing this, I think it's one pain that we've taken away from the survivor. So maybe I'm wrong, but I do consider it, compared to many other things, victimless. And I favor allowing people to make the choice, because quite frankly, I don't think the majority of people are going to be going, I want, today I think I'll have medical assistance in dying. Like, it's not an offhanded thing somebody's going to suddenly say, oh yeah, today is the day. It's not a whim. People are going to think about it. And you know, before a physician performs MAiD, they're going to talk to the person. And if it's a simple thing, they're going to say, well, have you thought about this? But what makes my life worth living is very different from what make either of your lives worth living. And yeah, I would favor less restriction rather than more.
Okay, I have one last question, and if any of you have any closing remarks, we can wrap up soon. It's the timing. This is something that I've seen people comment on, is that this feels like it's being rushed. Do any of you have any comments on that? I don't know. I feel like it's kind of, what is it, like 2 weeks they did in the Senate, right? Like, doesn't that seem kind of fast? No?
No, actually, the Senate has spent years and years and studies and studies and studies. They have probably spent the last 20 years looking repeatedly at this topic. So this is just a ruse by people who realize that politically they are clearly in the minority and they're not winning this one, and they're just trying to buy time. And so they're pretending there has been something rushed. The review of the current legislation that is taking place, Mark, that would happen was enshrined in the legislation when it was introduced in whatever it was, 2015 or whenever it was. So this review process has been ongoing. And we had months, in fact, to look at C-7. Senate had its own hearings. yeah, they have very clear opinions on this, because the truth is, when the legislation that we have currently in place was introduced, Senate already wanted something like what we will be getting now. They know exactly what they want. There is a long tradition of this. Senate was always clear what their views are on this issue, and surprisingly, this hasn't changed over the years. So this is why, so this didn't happen over 2 weeks. It might look like it to you, but there's years and years of debate in that chamber on this particular issue, and it just culminates in this. And it's not even surprising, because pretty much they said the same thing 6 years ago when this legislation was introduced. This is why this is not something that happened really rapidly. It's just it's coming up on our horizons as rapidly, because we did not spend monitoring this closely, what they did when they reviewed the last legislation and this legislation. So it looks like they did this all like in 10 days, and this is not really what happened. Okay.
I'd like to know what you think another week or another 2 weeks or another month would do. Like, the information is here. It's not like not like they're out gathering information, right? They have information. It isn't. This is not a science thing that they're deciding on. There's not a right or a wrong. It's a values thing. So my value is that every person has the right to do it. They're not going to do it on a whim. Give them the right to do it. That's my value. And you have somebody else who says, no, nobody should ever be able to end a life. You can have a month, you can have a year, you can have 10 years. And I don't think that's going to change, right?
Right.
Not for the individual, probably. It might change societally.
Okay. Well, that was my last question. Did any of you have any closing remarks before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just wanted to stress that the big bugbear, reasonably foreseeable, like a terminal illness, in other words, that's removed. In Canada, in January 2020, 70% of Canadians, when surveyed on this question, were in favor of removing reasonably foreseeable, like the terminal illness, quote unquote, thing. If you remove this, clearly when Canadians were aware of the implications of this, namely that you have to increase the circle of people who would be eligible once you remove terminal illness. So it's really important to recognize that all this kerfuffle that you hear at the moment, and the storm and the campaigning, it is a minority of Canadians that are worked up about it, and you cannot even claim that it is a majority of disabled people. We don't even know that. All we know is that they're louder at the moment, but we don't know is whether the people that are so loud, whether they represent even the bulk of people who would consider themselves disabled. So we should take most of this really with a grain of salt. My suspicion is when this is all said and done and you have progressive legislation, we will have annual reports, and I would predict that no major problems would happen, no major abuse would happen, there is no slippery slopes. We have seen these arguments for decades in other countries, and nothing really happened anywhere in any significant way.
Sandra?
No, I've really enjoyed the discussion, and it's been good to kind of revisit this, because I was very enmeshed in it some years ago, and I've kind of slid away from it. And I just I am always concerned when other people use their morality to make decisions for me, because I would like to use my morality to make decisions for me.
Well, thank you both for coming on the channel, and I really appreciated your time and the conversation. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It was
Thanks,
fun.
Mark.
Great evening. Take care.